Thank you so much, Paul, for that kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here at this beautiful Irish Linen Library and tonight to speak about Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson. And I'd particularly like to thank Barry for having me here, for inviting me. It's my first talk in the North since my book was published last May, so I'm really happy to be here. And I think of the Henry Wilson story as very much an all-Ireland story. Wilson's assassination on the 22nd of June was Ireland's Sarajevo and led on 6 days later to the Civil War, which was wholly a war confined to the south, but the reason for his assassination was all to do with the newly created entity called Northern Ireland. And I'll speak at length later about Wilson's visit to this town in January 1922, 4 months before he died, to unveil the statue of John Nicholson. And my attention was brought to this sketch here of Henry Wilson that was donated to the cathedral here by his wife, Cecil, in December 1922. And she couldn't have possibly have known that in January 1922 that her husband wouldn't be alive a year later. So it's a very tragic story for all concerned. So what's interesting about both Nicholson and Wilson is that they were Southern Unionists who became associated with Ulster Unionism. Let me start by talking about Wilson, who is the central subject of my talk tonight. Wilson, as I explained, was a Southern Unionist. He was born in Dublin to a family who had their residence in Curragran, County Longford. And the family were very much part of that vanished tribe known as Southern Unionists. But as Wilson pointed out many times when he was alive, he was in effect a displaced Ulster Unionist. Wilson made clear that his views that the Wilsons were an Ulster family, their roots were in Longford were shallow, and they had spent little time there. Instead, the Wilsons had spent something like 250 years in County Antrim, he said, after being elected as MP for the staunchly Unionist North Down constituency. Wilson identified himself as a Unionist and, just as importantly, was identified by Ulster Unionists as one of their own. His identification with the cause of Unionism, and specifically with the creation of Northern Ireland in May 1921, made him a hate figure for Republicans, and although some were shocked by his death, few were outraged. So the Wilsons can trace their ancestry in Ireland back to the Williamite Wars of the late 17th century. Henry Wilson was part of the seventh and last Wilson generation in Ireland. The original Irish Wilson was an Englishman, John Wilson, who was said to have arrived in the vanguard of King Billy in 1690, the most glorious year for the Unionist tradition. And Williams defeated the Catholic King James II, who had the support of most of his co-religious in Ireland, of course, secured the Protestant ascendancy in Ireland. The date is as much symbolic as actual. The Wilson family desire to be associated with King Billy's victory at the Battle of the Boyne is as important as the historic veracity of those claims, because Longford historian Dr. Riley Prunty's study of the family reveals that there was already a Robert Wilson living in Rashi, County Antrim, in 1622, which is listed in the Conor County Antrim Diocesan Administration. But it's John Wilson who is named in Arthur Young's Fighters of Derry as having fought at the Battle of the Boyne. So John received a grant of land at Rashi for his services, and the family remained there for many generations. His great-grandson Hugh made the family's first fortune in shipping in the late 1770s while retaining the land at Rashi. He bought a substantial property in Belfast and died in 1805 as a wealthy man. His fortune, his son William, Henry's grandfather, continued in the family tradition and made a fortune in the shipment of salted pork. He bought a house in Wellington Place where many of Belfast's most prosperous merchants lived. William Wilson had enough money to send 4 sons to Trinity College, Dublin, including Henry's father. And so William took advantage of the chaos and penury of the Irish famine to buy large swathes of land from encumbered landlords. He purchased 17,500 acres in 1849 at a time when many in the Irish landlord classes were bankrupted by the famine. William moved the seat of the family south to Dublin in 1850 and prospered further during the Crimean War, supplying provisions to the British Army. James, as the youngest of the 5 sons, inherited the smallest portion of the land, some 1,200 acres in the counties of Longford and Westmeath. So you can see that the Wilson family is really only 2 generations in Longford, but they do play a very, very important part in the county, in the history of that county. So, hence the happenstance that Henry Wilson happened to be born in a place that would later become a part of an independent Ireland. So the Currygran estate was sufficiently well run for Wilson's father James to spend most of his time on committees deliberating about the things that interested him most, namely the fate of Unionism and Anglicanism in Ireland. His wife, Henry's mother, Constance Grace Martha Hughes from Stillorgan near Dublin, was known locally as the Good Lady and ran both the estate and the household. Henry Wilson's brother James, Jemmy, known as Jemmy, was also a prominent unionist and wrote frequently to the newspapers about issues pertaining to Ireland. He stood in 2 general elections as a unionist candidate in Longford. He got 7% in one and 6% in the other. So he was something of a glutton for punishment. But I think it's interesting that one of the interesting points about the Wilsons is that they cleave to their unionist convictions all their life consistently, to the point of where they would get engaged in standing for election knowing that they were going to lose. And I think another thing I'd like to say about the Wilson family is, although their politics were different from the nationalist majority in Longford, they were not unpopular landlords. And in fact, General Sean McKeown, who was one of the IRA commanders in the War of Independence, said he very much regretted not being able to save Currygran House in August 1922 when it was burnt to the ground by the anti-treaty IRA. So I don't propose to go into detail about Wilson's elevation to the role of Chief of the Imperial General Staff following a career in the British Army in February 1918. Becoming the professional head of the British Army is not the subject of my talk, but I'd like to reference how it came to pertain to the town of Lisburn here. So Wilson was a covert supporter of Ulster Unionism, and particularly the UVF, going back to the Curra incident, also known as the mutiny in March 1914. At that stage, he was Director of Military Operations in the British Army. He was essentially, with great foresight as it turned out, preparing the British Army for war on the continent of Europe. Wilson was kept informed of developments during the crisis and covertly supported the potential mutiny. He thought it mad that the government would attempt to bring in Home Rule against the wishes of Unionists and a large section of the army. His private diary entries for those days showed his loyalties were with the UVF and not the government that he served. He wrote in his diary, "The arrangements of the Ulster Army are well advanced, and there's no doubt of the discipline and spirit of these men and officers, that they have bumped up against 100,000 men who are in deadly earnest, and that is neither the Cabinet nor Englishmen are ever in earnest about anything Ulster was certain to win." So Wilson was blamed by the British government for his intriguing, indeed would never have reached the highest rank in the British Army had Herbert Asquith remained as British Prime Minister for the duration of the war. He called Wilson this poisonous but clever serpent. So, but it was David Lloyd George who rehabilitated Wilson's reputation. Lloyd George saw him as differently as a maverick and original thinker from the Celtic fringes like himself. And Wilson was one of the men who won the war as far as many of his contemporaries were concerned, and he was held in the highest esteem. At the end of the war, he was part of the British delegation which negotiated the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. Presciently, as he turned out, he pleaded with the British government to go easy on Germany, believing that it would store up troubles for future generations, and he wasn't right about everything, but he was certainly right about that. So in 1919 he was made a Field Marshal, the highest rank in the British Army, not for his achievements in the field, which were scant as it turns out, but obviously for his role in putting together the Allied all-arms strategy which won the First World War. Yet Wilson receiving the high Field Marshal baton marked not only the high point of his standing in British public life, but also the beginning of his end of his relationship with the British government. The Irish War of Independence, which began in January 1919, maddened him, and he was adamantly against Irish separatism. He advocated the sternest military measures against his fellow Irishmen, up to and including martial law. This brought him into conflict with Lloyd George's government, and at the end of 1920, Lloyd George came to realise that the Crown forces were not just fighting in the south of Ireland against the IRA, but the bulk of the Irish population, hence his desire to make peace. And Wilson wanted nothing to do with the negotiations and refused many entreaties to meet his fellow Irishmen who were negotiating the treaty. We do not speak to murderers, he told an exasperated Lloyd George. Oh, nonsense, Lloyd George responded. In public life, we must do these things. So Wilson was even more maddened by the truce which ended the War of Independence in July 1921, and obviously more so even by the Anglo-Irish Treaty of December 1921, which established a free state. Wilson's response to the treaty was, as it had always been for Irish matters, an emotional one. It was, as his diary attests, an abject surrender to murderers. In short, he said, Ireland is gone. There's not one word about the loyal people of the South and West. So Lloyd George is getting on fast with the ruin of the empire. We shall incidentally lose our 16 Irish battalions and have to withdraw altogether from Ireland. It's quite impossible to see what all of this means. So again, Wilson was looking at this, the independence of the 26 counties of Ireland from the perspective as a British imperialist. He believed that it would mark the beginning of the end of the British Empire. And again, no more than with what he said about Germany and the Treaty of Versailles. He wasn't altogether wrong about that. But as a serving soldier, he could not articulate these views in public, but it's already well understood where he was coming from. In July 1921, Wilson was invited to the opening of the Northern Ireland Parliament, but declined the invitation as would look like he was taking a partisan position. He wrote to Sir James Craig, he says, stating, "My opinions on the Irish question are fairly well known. I have an unlimited belief in our corner of Ireland. In fact, so much so that I often tell those unfortunate English fellows that when they've made a hash of the empire, we Ulster boys will take over the show for them and let them see how to run a real imperial idea." Unfortunately for Wilson, this letter was intercepted by the IRA and published in the Irish Bulletin, which was an Irish IRA propaganda sheet. So it was obviously a source of embarrassment for Wilson, but he wrote it out. And in 1921, November 1921, he opened the Ulster Tower on the Somme. And my previous book, Wherever the Firing Line Extends, is about the architectural legacy that's left on the Western Front by the Irish experience, and obviously the Ulster Tower is a major part of that. So he unveiled that Ulster Tower on the Somme instead of either Craig or Carson. And so in January 1922, after the Anglo-Irish Treaty was passed by Dáil Éireann and the Free State established, he crossed to Ireland for the last time. And it is in that context that he visited this town on the 19th of November, January 1922, to unveil a statue in Lisburn of Brigadier John Wilson, who you all know was killed in 1857 during the Indian Mutiny. And I think what was interesting about Nicholson is, like Wilson, he was a Southern Irish Unionist stroke imperialist who was adopted here. Some of us, you know this better than I do, I suspect, but his father died young, and so the remaining Nicholsons moved to Lisburn, and which adopted him as one of their own. And he's very much identified with the cause of Ulster Unionism. And at the time that the statue was unveiled, the newsletter described him as one of the supermen of the 19th century and of all time, one of Britain's bravest and best, un chevalier sans peur et sans reproche. And the image of Nicholson as the redoubtable son of empire, bringing the people of the Punjab, who the newsletter described as the most ignorant, depraved and bloodthirsty in the land to heal, was noted by the newspapers. Right? So obviously, Nicholson was a man of his time, and the views of him was as a man of his time. We have nowadays, as you know, some of you know, the Black Lives Matter movement, and one of the statues that they have their eyes on is the John Nicholson statue here, and there is an Indian historian called William Dalrymple who suggests that it should be removed or sent to a museum. But I guess that's a story for another day. But anyway, not only was Wilson at that ceremony, so was James Craig, and the thing about Wilson was he only spoke very shortly at that, but he had passed through Dublin on the way to Lisburn, and he wrote in his diary that night, and his diaries are a fantastic source of information about him, that no sane man can imagine that Collins and Co., who none have ever even administered a typewriter, can be expected to keep law and order, and over 3 million people who have no sense of either, and that's either without any army or police. And obviously, bear in mind that in January 1922, Wilson is still the chief of the Imperial General Staff, although he doesn't have too long to go in the job. So a month later, his 4-year terms as SIGS is up. There's no question of him getting another term. He had, at this stage, not spoken to Lloyd George for 9 months. So it was with considerable relief on all sides that he vacated the role. And no sooner had he vacated the role than within 4 days, he was elected unopposed as the Ulster Unionist MP for North Down and took his seat in the House of Commons. So that was an incredible turnaround from being the chief of the Imperial General Staff to almost instantaneously becoming an Ulster Unionist MP. And it's in that guise that he was appointed in March 1922 as a military advisor to the Northern government at a time when the Northern Ireland Parliament had been only established in June 1921. The IRA, even though there had been a truce in the south from July of 1921, it wasn't. There was still a lot of problems with the IRA in the north as well. The truce had never been recognised in the north, so there was a lot of internecine fighting in the north. So Craig had asked Wilson for his advice on how best to deal with this kind of insurrection, and Wilson had written a long letter to him, and basically what the letter stated was that it was very important. The central point of it was that there had to be a clear line of command, and that all of the elements of the northern state, the newly established RUC, the B Specialists, the British Army, all had to be subject to military discipline. So what he had asked for wasn't particularly incendiary. It was more common sense as far as he saw it anyway. He also believed that and he probably was naive in this belief, that the B Specials should be established as a non-sectarian organisation, and that Catholics should be recruited into it according to their numbers. In any case, his advice was published in the newspapers, and at a speech in the Northern Parliament announcing Wilson's role as military advisor, Craig said that he had put aside £2 million to justify their pledge to Wilson to do everything he asked in his advice to them as to how to respond to the security threat. Craig said there was no better man to deal with the IRA. I would say if any man can devise means to meet these hordes of IRAs and promoters of rebellion, that man is Sir Henry Wilson. So there's been much speculation over the last 100 years as to the motivations for the assassination of Wilson. And just to recap, Wilson was shot dead on the doorstep of his own home by 2 veterans of the Great War turned IRA operatives, Reggie Dunn and Joseph O'Sullivan. And both of them had served in the First World War. They were British-born, London-born, and O'Sullivan had lost his leg at Passchendaele. And because of his evident disability, they were quickly apprehended, trying to flee from the scene, put on trial and sentenced to death, and they were hanged on the 10th of August 1922. And in their statement, which was issued posthumously 2 days after they died, Dunn and Sullivan addressed the subject as to why they killed Wilson. Who was Henry Wilson? What was his policy and what did he stand for? You've all read in the newspapers lately and been told that he was the great British Field Marshal, but his activities in other fields are unknown to the bulk of the British public. The nation to which we have the honour to belong, the Irish nation, knows him not as much as the great British Field Marshal, but as the man behind what is known in Ireland as the Orange Terror. He was at the time of his death the military advisor to what is colloquially called the Ulster government, and as military advisor he raised and organised a body of men known as the Ulster Special Constabulary, who are the principal agents in his campaign of terrorism. So the Orange Terror that they were referring to was the outbreak of internecine violence which broke out in the north from July 1920 to the autumn of 1922, in which almost 500 people died. That bout of violence is known colloquially as the Belfast pogroms. The term is disputed, not least because it wasn't just confined to Belfast, as we know here, and it began with riots in Derry in June 1920, in which 12 people were killed, and the violence became more widespread a month later. And on the 12th of July 1920, Sir Edmund Carson made a speech to 25,000 Orangemen outside Belfast, in which he said, "We in Ulster will tolerate no Sinn Féin organisation, no Sinn Féin methods," etc. And there were riots in Banbridge after the funeral of Lieutenant Colonel Gerard Bryce Smith, the divisional commander of the RUC, who had been sent from London to stiffen the resolve of the force in dealing with the IRA. Smith had made a notorious speech at Ristole police station in County Kerry on the 19th of June 1920, in which he exhorted the men to shoot suspected Republicans on sight. The speech was circulated to the nationalist press by RUC officers who mutinied rather than enforce his will. And the most notorious line, disputed by Smith himself, came when he told the assembled men, "You may make mistakes occasionally, and innocent people may be shot, but that cannot be helped, and you're bound to get the right person sometimes. The more you shoot, the better I will like you, and I assure you that no policeman will get in trouble for shooting any man." And as a result of Smith's killing, the town's Protestants majority targeted Catholic businesses. In Banbridge, over a 3-day period, shops were destroyed and many Catholic families driven from their home. On that same day, an organisation calling itself the Belfast Protestants Association summoned all Unionist and Protestant workers to a meeting in the Harland and Wolff shipyards, and the Protestant majority workforce passed a resolution stating that they would not work alongside Sinn Féiners, and 8,000 Catholics and approximately 2,000 quote-unquote rotten prods, those from a trade union or perceived left-wing background, were expelled from the shipyards, foundries and factories, and Catholic considered to be disloyal were thrown into the River Lagan and pelted with rivets and bolts known as Belfast confetti, and disloyal workers were expelled from other prominent factories in the city. So this is the situation in the summer of 1922, and it gets worse here in this city on the 22nd of August 1920, when the IRA took their assassination campaign north, and they shot dead the district inspector Oswald Swansea as he left a church service here, and the killing was in revenge for the assassination of the Lord Mayor of Cork, Thomas McCurtain, in March of 1920. And an inquest into McCurtain's death held Swansea directly responsible and Lloyd George indirectly responsible for the killing. And Michael Collins sent 4 of his best men from Cork to the north to carry out the hit. And symbolically, Swansea was killed in an act of revenge using McCurtain's revolver. And again, like with the killing of Smith Bryce, this caused a ferocious backlash against the Catholic population, and Catholic premises were burned and families forced to flee the town. And those who left by the road to Belfast were further targeted, and many fled with their belongings over a mountain pass. And then the violence again spread to Belfast that week, and 22 people were killed in the week after the Swansea killing. And this prompted Sir James Craig, then a junior member of the coalition government in the UK, not here, and soon to be the first Prime Minister of Northern Ireland. He persuaded the British Cabinet in October in 1920 to set up the Ulster Special Constabulary as an auxiliary to the Royal Irish Constabulary. So you can see that when Donnan O'Sullivan, in writing their letter, stating that Wilson had established the Ulster Special Constabulary, that he hadn't done that at all, that it had been established 2 years before Wilson became involved. And this is a pattern that happens when we consider Wilson. Wilson is blamed for everything bad that is done to the nationalist population, both north and south. He is, for instance, he was blamed at the time for ordering the execution of Kevin Barry, who became a Republican martyr in November 1920. He was only a lad of 18 summers, as the song goes. But in fact, Wilson had actually argued the opposite. He suggested that the government stay its hand and not kill Kevin Barry for the reasons that I just told you about, but he was overruled in that sense. But, and this is what I go into in detail in the book, the fact of the matter is there's a public perception of Wilson, and then there is the private Wilson, the one who's a bit more thoughtful, who writes private letters despairing of the sectarian violence that's going on here, and yet that side of Wilson is never brought to the public attention, and certainly not brought to the attention of Nationalist Ireland. And so I just, I'm going to conclude by saying that Wilson was not involved in raising the specials, and nor was he responsible for the Special Powers Act, which was brought in by Dawson Bates, who was the Minister for Home Affairs in March 1922. But critically, he again became associated with the Special Powers Act. But Wilson is blameworthy in this sense, in that he showed no interest in fairness or even-handedness in public. For a man who held such a senior position in the British Army and whose judgment was trusted by politicians during the First World War, his subsequent utterances were unworthy. And in his brief spell as a politician, he exhibited neither tact nor good judgment. And he made a bad situation here worse, but so did his assassination. And Wilson, despite his manifest faults, which I've listed in the book, detested military indiscipline from wherever it came. He may have hated the IRA, but he also detested the Black and Tans and the B Specials. He was consistent, at least in that regard. And he was not responsible for the pogroms in the north. He tried to bring them to the end. And if anything, his proposals, partisan as they were designed to stop this kind of arbitrary killing on the part of state forces. Nevertheless, his irresponsible rhetoric emboldened some of those responsible for his outrages, but it was not sufficient to justify his death. And in short, his death was morally wrong. Worse than that, it was counterproductive and totally disastrous to the South. As I said, the Wilson assassination was Ireland's Sarajevo. On foot of it, the British government blamed the anti-treaty rebels currently occupying the forecourts. Michael Collins and the provisional government were left with no choice but to open fire on the rebels, so beginning the Irish Civil War. And they were still living with the consequences of that war 100 years on. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions.
Ronan, can I ask, after his assassination, how did that pan out in Northern Ireland? What was the reaction?
Yeah, it's a good question, Paul. There was a direct, I'm just going to find it here in the book, I should possibly have mentioned it, but there was, on foot of his assassination, there were 3 Catholics in Cushendall who were killed the following night. I'm just going to try and find it here. And there was a message left on their bodies, so it would have had an impact here as well, although not to the same extent in the south. And one of the reasons that was given for one of the reasons posthumous justifications for the assassination of Wilson was that as a result of his assassination, basically the targeting of Catholics ended, and the pogroms in Belfast ended. But in point of fact, they had already been petering out, and the reality is that a more consequential assassination north was the assassination of William Twaddell. Is that right? Twaddell, does some of you know that name? He was an Ulster Unionist MP here. And that would have had more, that prompted the lifting of an awful lot of Republican suspects. So yes, it did have consequences. I'm just trying to find that part in the book where there was three people killed as a result of that, directly as a result of his killing.
Your killing seemed to be a sort of spur of the moment thing between, with killers. I mean, they had no plan to escape. They obviously had no chance of escaping after shooting Wilson. So how disorganised or organised was it supposed to be from the IRA point of view?
What's your name?
Charles.
Charles. That's a very good question. The answer is yes and no. As I point out in the book, there was an edict from on high, from Michael Collins, to kill Wilson if the opportunity ever arose. And obviously, to kill anybody, as they say, you need motivation and you need opportunity. So the motivation was there for Dunn and O'Sullivan to do it. The opportunity came as a result of there had been an IRA meeting on the 21st of June in Mooney's Pub in Holborn. Somebody walked in with the evening newspaper, put it down on the desk, and there, in one paragraph, on page 5 of the Evening News, was a paragraph to say that Henry Wilson was going to unveil a memorial at Liverpool Street Station the following day. And there was your opportunity to kill Wilson. And Reggie Dunn, who was there, volunteered because he was the officer commanding the London IRA. He offered to carry out the killing, and the only person who was available at the time to do it was Reginald Dunn, who had lost a leg at Ypres, as I explained, and there was supposed to have been a third man, a guy called Dennis Kelleher, and we only know that there was a third man because of the recently released Bureau of Military History pension files. He was supposed to turn up with a car, and he didn't. So yes, you're right. Why didn't, was there any chance they were going to get away? Well, they had hoped that a guy in a car was going to turn up, but unfortunately for them, what happened was that they shot Wilson on the doorstep of his home at number 36 Eaton Place, which is right in the centre of London, and very close to a police barracks. And so the police would have heard the shooting. They chased after him. Dunn and O'Sullivan shot 2 policemen trying to escape. Luckily, those policemen survived, and they were caught. Obviously, it was a shambles of a job, but if Dennis Kelleher had turned up with the car as he was supposed to do, they might have had a fighting chance of getting away, but they didn't. Just to go back to your question, Paul, the original question. I'll just read this passage from my diary, from the book. A day after the Wilson shooting, RUCNA specials shot dead 3 Catholics: Seamus McAllister, 18, John Gore, 22, and John Hill, 30, in Cushendall, County Antrim. One of the specials who shot John Gore was heard to say, "You're one of the bastards who shot Wilson." And all 3 men were found dead behind an alleyway in the town. So that answers your question.
Could I just ask a question? You alluded to the fact about Asquith, saw through him pretty much. Yeah. Was it due to the fact of the weakness of the coalition government and the kind of demise of Asquith's power that, or was it just a political culture at the time against the military that they couldn't sack somebody for not doing their job as within a government? Wilson
escaped. Are you talking about the Curragh mutiny here? Yeah.
You said about the
yeah. Well, a lot of people got sacked as a result of that. John, Selly, I think is his name, the defence secretary, he had to go. He was the Minister for War, I think, at the time. John French, Field Marshal Sir John French, had to go as well. He was reinstated at the start of the war, but he resigned as a result of the Curragh incident. There was Paget, I think, was another one who resigned as a result of it. But Wilson had this kind of plausible deniability that they couldn't pin it on him. There was no paper trail. They just suspected his involvement, so they couldn't sack him. But as I said, in 1914, he would have had, actually, when French was sacked as the chief of the Imperial General Staff in December 1915, Wilson would have had a reasonable claim for the position, but he didn't get it until February 1918. So,
I'd just like to ask about Henry Wilson's own inspirations, because he was mentored to a certain extent by Field Marshal Earl Roberts, who actually was with Nicholson in the Indian Mutiny. So there's a connection there as well. How influential was Nicholson on Earl Roberts and then Henry Wilson?
Very much so. I mean, Roberts was another Anglo-Irish, so they're all Anglo-Irish basically. Although Roberts was born, I think, in India, his family seat's in Waterford. So you have Nicholson, who's Dublin. You have Roberts, who's Waterford, and then you have Wilson, who's Longford. And obviously, Roberts is a very, very important part of the Wilson story. Roberts was the one who took Wilson under his sort of tutelage during the Boer War. Roberts lost his son in the Boer War, and he treated Wilson almost like a son. Wilson had a genius for inveigling his way into the company of important people. But to answer your question, I guess there were three Irish imperialists. There was the British imperialists, but they were from the Irish tradition, and I do think that brought a special sort of ardour to imperialism abroad. And so Wilson would have been, he would have very much a believer in the imperial project at that stage. He had actually served in India. He'd served in Burma as well in the 1870s. So he would have seen the Indian Mutiny as Nicholson having saved the empire. And as I say in the book, that it's very hard to pin down Wilson's nationality. He described himself as Irish. He certainly didn't see himself as English. I say that his country was the British Empire. He didn't even see himself as British as such. He saw his country as being the British Empire, and therefore he would have seen Nicholson as somebody who was trying to preserve what Wilson would have seen, as well as Nicholson, as one of the great forces for civilization in the world.
Hi, Ronan Dominic is my name. Hi, you towards the end of your talk, you were talking about something really interesting about the public perception of Wilson and the private Wilson, which was quite intriguing, and you kind of answered a bit of it when you talked about, like, as a politician, he displayed no fairness nor even-handedness, no tact nor good judgment as a politician. But in his own private writings that you have viewed in the research for your book, is there a contradiction in him as a person, or does some of that tactlessness manifest itself in his own private thoughts and how he actually wrote about the conflict and how the society was being turned upside down and they were trying to deal with it on a day-to-day basis? Because we can look back at it and we see how it turned out, but they didn't know how it was going to turn out.
Yeah, well, fortunately for historians, Wilson kept a very copious diary, which was published in a 2-volume series in 1927 by his friend Charles Caldwell, and they kind of damned his reputation for ever and a day, because he came across as this sort of ingrate and conniver and contemptuous of politicians, contemptuous of a lot of his colleagues in the army, an intriguer, etc., etc. But when it comes to the subject of Ireland, I mean, there's no question that he was somebody to the right, even of Craig and Carson when it came to Ireland. Whereas Craig and Carson reluctantly accepted the settlement as a result of the partition of Ireland and the creation of Northern Ireland and the creation of the South. Wilson just could never bring himself to accept that, ever. But, I mean, to answer your question, as I said, he was a lot more thoughtful in his private utterances than he was in his public ones, especially when it came to, the situation here in the north. He correctly diagnosed the problem that if security forces don't have the confidence of the entire community, you're storing up trouble for yourself in the future. He wrote about a campaign to get. He wrote privately as well to Craig in a private letter to get Catholics into the specials, into the RUC, and he said that I'm not trying to be partisan here. What you really need is everybody who's loyal, as he put it. Now that happened to be most people who were loyal in the north were obviously of the Unionist tradition. There may have been some Catholics, I don't know, but he certainly he came across in his public utterances at that time as being deranged, really, because he was talking about from March until his death in 1922 of re-invading the South, of sending in a strong man, maybe even himself, to restore order in the South, to which Collins and others, even the sort of his Southern Unionists sort of wrote to the newspapers in Britain saying, what are you talking about? Like, there's no war here. People are getting on with things. The Earl of Mayo, who would have been of the same class as himself, said, people are getting on with their lives here. Look at what's happening in the north. You're supposed to be the military advisor in the north. Look at the situation there. To use a Bible exhortation, take the plank out of your own eye and not the splinter out of everybody else's. So that was his attitude, yeah.
I was just wondering, were high-profile military men very vulnerable in the South in the 20s? Oliver Nugent, for instance, I think he lived his life very well with his neighbours when he came back from the First World War. Would that be right?
Yeah. Actually, there has been a myth going around for, especially in the last 25 years, that all the ex-British servicemen who returned to the South were, had to keep their heads low and they were shot at and all the rest. There's been a recent book on that which has discounted that. Yes, there were ex-British soldiers who were killed during the War of Independence or disappeared by the IRA, but they were generally killed because they were perceived to be loyal and to be spies. But to answer your question, yes, Oliver Nugent, I think, lived out his life in Cavan. But what's more interesting is Brian Cooper, who was the general commanding the 10th Irish Division, actually became a senator in the Irish Senate, as did the General Hickey, who was the general commanding the 16th Irish Division. So a lot of those men, they didn't flee the South or anything like that. They just knuckled down and got on with things, and they weren't targeted by Republicans at all.
Did the Wilson family in Longford, did any of the relatives remain there in Longford and try to influence Wilson himself and his attitude?
No, not really. It's a very, very sad story, actually, with the Wilson family. They had left in January 1921 anyway. They left Currygram behind them. This was when the War of Independence was at its height, and Jamie, who's Wilson's brother, had been threatened by Sean McKeown that he was going to burn Currygram to the ground. Ironically enough, given that McKeown would have said he would have tried to save Currygram in August 1922. He had nothing against the family apart from their political views. But anyway, Jamie went off to England January 1921, and Curry Grant was burnt to the ground in August 1922. Now, I haven't seen private correspondence between Jemmy and Henry, partially because when I was writing my book, I couldn't get over, because I was writing it during COVID, couldn't get over to the archives. But Jemmy was of the same mindset, really, as Henry, but he just expressed himself in more, in less trenchant terms, let me put it to you that way. But Sean McKeown told Jemmy to tell his brother that if the British forces didn't stop burning houses in Longford, that McKeown would burn Curry Grant to the ground. And Jemmy says, well, look, I'll ask my brother, I don't know what he'll say, but I have no influence over him. But as it turns out, the burnings did stop. So maybe that was a coincidence, I don't know.
My name's Hugh. Michael Collins got blamed wrongly for being behind the assassination?
No, the opposite is true. He got blamed. He didn't get blamed for it. The British government blamed the anti-treaty forces who were holed up in the forecourts. But my book, the central question that I attempted to answer in my book is: we know what happened. We want to know who ordered the shooting. That's the central question that I've sought to address in this book. And Michael Collins was the organizer in my view, and I am strengthened in that view by correspondence which I have received since the original book was published, which will be in a later edition, stating that basically Michael Collins gave the order to shoot Wilson. And as a result of having ordered the shooting of Wilson, he basically signed his own death warrant, because 2 months to the day after Wilson was shot dead, Michael Collins was shot dead at Bale-na-Blah.
You've mentioned that Wilson said about even-handedness among the different communities here. Do you think was his views reinforced or strengthened in any way by what happened in Banbridge and what happened in Lisburn, in the aftermath of the Swansea killing?
Yeah, he was really shocked. He was really shocked by both of those killings. He basically felt, he made a famous comment at that time that, he said, why covertly, why engage in covert activity? Just take the IRA out and shoot them. He says, well, why do it covertly when you can do it overtly? You're in charge, you're the government, So he was very shocked by those deaths, but he just didn't understand the depth of sort of the sectarian killings around that time. He didn't really understand it, and but it certainly was a factor in him in his estrangement from the British government. He felt that the killings of both Swansea and Smith were, they weren't killings as such, they were assassinations, because these guys were high profile. He felt that the government was, the British government was basically fighting with one hand behind its back in dealing with the IRA. So he basically felt that rather than covertly, sneakily sort of burn places out and that the government should be quite open in its policy of assassinating IRA suspects.
Hello, my name's Dinah. Hi, I'm just wondering, the two men who actually killed him, it's something ironic. I don't know that they're both English. Yeah. They both served in the First World War. One of them had lost his leg. Had they, shell shock or what we call now PTSD sort of thing, or just there's something. I'm wondering, was that unit active in London? It just seems strange they're in a pub the night before and they just kind of come up with the idea to shoot him the next day.
Well, there's one of the things that has become apparent in recent years. There was a book on the subject of IRA operations in Great Britain during the War of Independence between 16 and 23. There was a recently published book on that, but even that didn't have the details of the military service pensions collection files. These are, so every IRA volunteer who wanted a state pension had to account for his movements, and he had to account for his actions during the war, and he had to get references and so on. So if I said, I was involved in this ambush on, say, Beggar's Bush Barracks or something like that, that my commanding officer would have to say, yeah, Ronan McGreevy was involved in that. So this has brought a huge wealth of material to the fore now, especially about the London IRA. So the London IRA were engaged in, basically their role was to buy guns, to smuggle them through to the ports, to smuggle them onto boats and to get them back to Ireland. And what's really, really interesting is, I don't know if any of you watch Peaky Blinders. Anybody here watch Peaky? Yeah, it's great, isn't it? The first two series. In the first series, right, you have the what do you call them? The Shelby Steel, a cache of machine guns from the Birmingham munitions works, and the IRA are after those guns, right? That was all made up by Stephen Knight when he wrote Peaky Blinders. He just made it up, like me, as you would do. And then you get this inspector over from the north to Belfast to try and relocate these guns. So the IRA are after all of these guns. What happens now that we've had the release of the military pension service collection files is now we know that this was substantially true, that the IRA were trying to source guns from gangs, Jewish gangs in the East End of London, Italian gangs, and from the Birmingham mob as well. And so they were involved in basically stealing guns. Also, Reggie Dunn and Joe Sullivan and their brother Pat were all wounded veterans of the First World War, so they all had this wound badge, and they could walk in and out of barracks. They walked into Woolwich Barracks and nobody suspected them. At that stage there were literally millions of rifles, millions of Lee Enfields and Colt 45s and so on, just piled up in heaps in these places because the British Army had been demobbed. What are we going to do with all these weapons? So they were able to walk in and with impunity into these barracks with their Cockney accents and their wound badges and their records and steal hundreds of weapons for the IRA. Joe Sullivan actually went to Ireland and he hid cartridges for a .303 Lee Enfield rifle in his wooden leg. And when he got to Cork, the British soldiers were looking at the vessel that was coming in, the ferry that was coming in. They were saying, "What happened to you, mate?" And he said, heard the Cockney accent, said he lost his leg at Ypres, and he says, "I'll give you a lift and he says, "Where do you want to go?" So the British Army basically gave Joe O'Sullivan a lift to his brother's house, not knowing that Joe O'Sullivan had secreted within his person 450 rounds of ammunition for a .303, and then also that Pat had stolen machine guns from Woolwich Barracks, and he put them in 4 golf bags, and he stuck them into the golf bags, and then he put the golf clubs on top. So when they got on the ferry, like they looked like a party of British tourists going to Ireland to play golf, and he had smuggled in the guns in the bags. So anyway, all of that stuff has come to light now. We didn't know any of this stuff even 10 years ago. So basically the IRA were very active in London, but the most important thing that they were active in was planning for assassinations. So what I point out in my book, that from the conscription crisis of March 1918, the IRA had planned to kill members of the British cabinet. They just never got around to it for a couple of different reasons, one of which was it was called off after the conscription crisis ended, and then in 1920 it was resurrected by Michael Collins, but then the peace talks started coming, those peace feelers, so they felt by 1921 that if they assassinated a member of the British cabinet, it'd be a hell of a lot harder to bring about a peace settlement. So So there you go.
Ronan, thank you so much for such an interesting talk.
Thank you so much for all the interesting questions as well. Really appreciate it.
It's really good to have a better understanding of the persona of Henry Wilson. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd ask you just to show your appreciation.
Thanks so much for coming out.